All right, so all right, sorry. All right, so welcome everyone to Software Saturdays Lesson 2, Week 2. This is the beginning tracks I already mentioned. This is a quick review of the track. If you weren't here last week or didn't already see, last week we started with HTML and CSS. Those recordings and slides are posted on Brightspace, so feel free to review those, or if you were here and still want to review, you're more than welcome to check that out and check out the examples we have on GitHub. So this week we're doing JavaScript, and then at which point we'll start to move on to the ReactJS framework, and then we'll do React more, then we'll touch on APIs and connecting that to React. So there's extra help available aside from these Saturday sessions. Every Saturday we're going to have 2-hour sessions. You can again rewatch these that are going to be recorded online. And then there's also open review hours that you can go to on Wednesdays from 6 to 7, in which one or more of us will be at these meetings. You can hop online, ask us questions, examples, help with your code, anything you need to better understand the curriculum and the project, however you'd like to go about that. Then, of course, you can also message us in the Slack. Should all be on that by now, and we can get back to you, one of us as soon as we possibly can. All right, so you should be on Slack by now. If you aren't on Slack, definitely take a picture of that link, join that however you need to. But get on there and you should already be on Brightspace. If you're not, reach out to one of us. We'll try to figure it out. But I believe everyone is at this point. All right, so then please have a text editor open. We mentioned this briefly last week. Visual Studio Code is a great editor if you don't already have one in mind. Anything really works. That's a great one. If you don't have time to download that right now, you can always open something as simple as Notepad or TextEdit if you're on a Mac. Just something to write your code in, and then you can launch it. And then all the demo files and examples on GitHub would be Software Saturdays. The links there, and if you don't want to type that out, you can just find the slides. Copy that link. Also, if you just want to install Node.js APM, it should already be done, but if you haven't already, go ahead and do that. It's a pretty simple process, and that's just so that we can have the JavaScript packages that we need. All right, so getting into the meat of the today, JavaScript. So JavaScript is a language that we use to work with HTML and CSS elements. More or less, the HTML and CSS is the display, and then JavaScript is the language we can use to actually interact with them and create functionality and logic per se. It's very high level. There's a lot of powerful features, libraries, methods, functions. So in essence, it can do a lot. A lot of it we'll teach. A lot of it you can also just Google and look up. If you think you can do it with JavaScript, you probably can. So that's how we use to work with the HTML pages and the CSS to connect them and build the functionality. And for anyone who has worked with Python or C before, it's very similar in that sort of style. And if you've done any programming before, it's also very similar, easy to catch on. So this is just some of the basic syntax. This is mostly for declarations. The var, that creates a basic variable that can be changed. Then the let is another form of variable. That's the variable we're going to be using in this class. It's safer, but both of them create variables that can use, such as signing numbers, strings, words, however you want to do that. Then functions, that's just the start of a JavaScript function. These are really important to JavaScript. That's how you can create a lot of your logic and code reusability, so you're not writing the same thing over and over. You create a function that does a certain task, and then you can call that by letting it reuse the same functionality. That's just basic there. And then the document, that's important for actually connecting to the HTML. So you can do logic in JavaScript. And then when you want to actually modify, change, interact with any of the HTML, you can use the document keyword, and that'll allow you to connect with that. And we'll get more into that and how that works later on. Here's just more JavaScript syntax. The if statement, that defines literally an if statement. And that's when you create your conditional. For example, if you want this to happen, for example, if the number is less than 2, That's how you just do that if x is less than 2, for example. And that's how you can create conditionals or cases when you're trying to figure out, do I want to do this or that? And that's where the else comes into play. If you run an if statement and it's not true, the condition is just not true, then you can have an else condition, and that will say, if it's not true, do this because it's else. And that's how you can create basically ways to define different things. If the number is greater than 2, you can do this, or if it's else, if it's less than 2, you can do that. And that's how we create some of that logic. And then we have loops on the right. The for loop is a really nice compact loop. It's more of a predefined loop. We'll show the syntax for that later, but it allows you to count for a set number of times. And then the while loop does a similar loop, but while a condition is true, and then that condition can be modified throughout the loop. Again, we'll show more of that later. That's just some of the basic syntax for creating these things. All right, so then JavaScript math operators. These are really useful. There's also some basics that you can check on. The plus signs for addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. The only, the asterisk is for multiplication, not the X. That's the only real change there. And the modulus operator is really important, especially for some of these checkpoints. The modulus operator takes the remainder, more or less. So, for example, if you had 5 modulus 3, it's going to return 2 because it divides 5 by 3 and then outputs the remainder. So, for example, 5 divided by 3 would be 1, where there remains 2, so it would return 2. And that's really helpful when you're trying to figure out even or odd numbers, or if multiples, anything like that. That is really useful. So understanding that takes the remainder. And then 2 asterisks, that's just for exponents. So, for example, if you wanted to raise 3 to the 3rd power, you can, 3 asterisk 3. Pretty straightforward logic. Modulus probably is least familiar for most of you. So just take that into mind. Very useful. All right, then we have JavaScript comparison operators, and this is when you use these predominantly in your if else and loops, because that's when you determine your condition. If the number is less than 2, if the number is greater than equal to 6, if it's not equal to 4, that's where this comes to play. So the less than signs, less than equal to, those are pretty straightforward. And then a key thing is equal to. Use 2 equal signs. That indicates comparison. If you were to use 1 equal sign, that's the assignment operator. So we'll get there later. But when you declare a variable, you use 1 equal sign. But when you compare 2 numbers, you use 2, and that's the distinction for JavaScript. Are you assigning a variable or are you comparing it? And then not equal to, that's with exclamation equals. And then the 3 equal signs is important because that's, as it says up there, strict equal to, in the sense that it doesn't allow any type conversions. So for example, if you had 4, the number 4 inside quotation marks, it would recognize that as a word. And if you set that equal 2 equals to 4, it's going to tell you that it's equal because it's going to convert the word to a number and then say 4 is equal to 4. If you use 3 equals, then it's not going to do any conversions and it's going to return a false. So we'll show an example for that later. But understanding that the 3 equals is more of a literal comparison is important. And then likewise, not equal to is strict not equal to. Okay, so this is how we add JavaScript to the HTML. You use in add actual HTML file. You can use a script tag. So that syntax is up there. You can also check that in our examples. But it's just an open closed script. And then what you do is you say script of the SRC is for source, and you just assign that to be your JavaScript file. So likewise, when you made your CSS files that styles the data, you have your HTML file and your CSS, and you include the CSS in the HTML using the tag. You can do the same with the JavaScript. It's just script source equals script.js, or whatever the name of your JavaScript file is. If you named it my JavaScript.js, then you'd write my JavaScript.js script. That's how you include it in the HTML file to allow the HTML to read your JavaScript and interact with it. All right, so I'm going to show demo program number 1. Hold this up. And okay, so you guys should be able to see. Oh, online can't see the Visual Studio. Let me I'm going to reshare it so you guys can see everything. I think they can see it. If anyone can't see the code to the right and the tab to the left, let me know. But so as you see on the left, this is just some basic HTML that's static, and that's shown in this one here. That's just that it's a pretty standard file. You guys did something very similar last time. And then the JavaScript in there just goes over some console logs, and we'll get into what the console log is later, but more or less console log is just a display. So what'll happen is if you think of that as like a print statement, more or less, if you've ever programmed before, and that just gives output. But as you can see here at the bottom, there's these math operators and all that stuff there. And then what I'll do is I'm going to pull up the log. So if you go to inspect elements in console, what you can do is then see the console logging. As you can see, we've got a whole bunch of data in here. And that's just, if you go to settings, developer tools, inspect element, and then console log. But so what it does is it gives a bunch of outputs here. So it first logs, or just declares basic variables, let test equal to So that's just assigning a variable over here. Assigning a variable is equal to a string. And think of that as a word. You put that in quotation marks. And then other than that, they're just showing you put in a number, how that works. And then these show all the comparison operators down over here. So 5 less than 6, it displays true. 5 less than equal to 5 displays true. And then if you get down to 4 greater than equal to 7, you see false, because 4 is less than 7, not greater than. And then we indicate our math operators. You'll be able to see these are pretty straightforward. The one important one I want to highlight is this math test equals math test 5 by 7. If you can see, math test equals 0. So what I'm going to do is change that to 10. And okay. Okay, you see it's here. So that's the 3, because 10 of modulo 7, 10 divided by 7, 1 with a remainder of 3. That's just one I wanted to point out. The rest of the math should be pretty straightforward. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. But that's just an important example. And then this down here, it illustrates some really basic logic. If the math test is equal to the variable test, the var test, it just logs true. And then if that condition is not true, that's where your else comes into play. So you're getting every conditional. And that would be else display false. And then here's some basic loops. The conditional for loops is basically identical to if and else's, except that it's instead of going into one time and exiting, it just loops through it. So as you can see, while I is less than 4, you log the I and then you increment the I, because then it continues up. Otherwise, if I stayed the same forever and it's always true, it would loop forever. You don't want that. You want to make sure that your loops can be broken out of. For example, because if I was equal to 0, I would always be less than 4 if you never changed I, and you'd never get out of that loop. And that's not good practice. Then down here shows a for loop. We'll get a little bit more into those later, but the basic syntax there is declaring a variable, saying what the condition of it, either less than something, greater than something, greater than equal to something, and then incrementing it either greater plus is the shorthand for I equals I plus 1. So when it's I plus, it's just think of it as increment I by 1. And likewise, we did I minus, that's decrement I by 1. So it'd be like 10, 9, 8, 7, 6 for I minus. And then in this example, with I equals 0, I plus, it'll go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And if you did I plus, and I plus is just by 1. And this is over here, the demo. This is just in simple HTML. That's not as important. It's just seeing how the the JavaScript works on this console log. And again, you can play around these examples. It'll also be posted on GitHub. Moving on to variables var. Okay, so we mentioned var and let earlier. We're gonna put it out there. Do not use a var. You want to use let. That is what we're gonna use here. As it says up there, there's some safety precautions and protections. More or less, one basic explanation, it has to do with scoping. So for example, if you declare a variable, you have a variable somewhere, you can accidentally change it in a place you don't want to if you use var, whereas let is much safer in that regard. So instead of working with something and accidentally changing it and messing up your whole program and you're not really sure what's going on, we're just going to use let because it's easier to not make that. So we're not using use var. Whenever you make a variable, or variable, not a constant, use let. Okay, so I mentioned this earlier. We were there, but just going back to it for the types of equality, I already mentioned, but the double equals that allows the JavaScript to convert beforehand. As I already mentioned, if you have the word for in quotation marks equal to 4, it'll convert to a number and say they're equal. Whereas if you have the 3 equals, it will not allow any conversions. So if it's not literally the same, it will say that it is false. So the word for, or quotation for quotation equals 4 will return false because it's saying they're not literally the same, because one is a number and the other is a word. I mean, and it's a number, but it's a word because you have to put it. Then you can also check out more about the equality table. We passed the link. If you're interested, definitely check it out. Okay, so this is an example of what bad can happen. As you see, my example is 4, this example is 12, but the concept stays the same. That in this example here, it allows them to convert. It converts this to a number and says it's true. But in the literal comparison, it realizes that this isn't a number, so it returns false. And likewise, if you say true and false is a 1 or a 0. That's the simple Boolean logic. So if you have 0, it's going to return false. If you have any other number, especially with 1, it's going to return true. So normally, if you say 1 is equal to true, you can say true because it'll convert either the 1 to a true or the 2 to a 1 and say they're equal. However, if you literally compare them, you're going to get a false because it recognizes that the symbol 1 is not equal to this true. So you want to be careful when you're doing comparisons that you don't, set up a conditional or a loop that doesn't respond how you want because there wasn't time for conversions or it converted when you don't want it. So be careful when using those symbols. Generally, my advice is use 2 equals if you're not sure, but keep in mind functionality of both. All right, so then we're going to JavaScript functions. We mentioned that basically earlier, but functions, they can have parameters and return values. So for example, you have a function, you name your function, let's say function my function, and then the parameters are things you can send to the function. So if you want to give it the numbers or a variable 1 and 2, then it can return whatever you want using those numbers and other things. So if you want to have a function that adds, you can have function myAdder, send it 2 numbers, and then you can say the sum is equal to the first number plus the second number and return the sum. And then if for example, if you send it 1 and 2, you'll get 3. 3 and 4, you'll get 7. And that's the key to parameters and return, because the parameters are what you give the function to work with, and then the return value is what the function gives out. So like think of that as its task. When you do a function, you have an output value. That's your return. You're returning what it gets. So as I mentioned already, the parameters change the results program. And that's why functions are so great, is because they become reusable in the sense that you can use different input and the function will do basically the same thing with different numbers or different information. Instead of having to write out the code multiple times, the function can just do it repeatedly for you, more or less. And then, I mentioned they can return data. That's just important so that you understand what the function is. And that way, your program can use the information from the function. Get the demo 2. Function. Let's see. All right, so again, this is just the basic page. We're going to be looking more at the console than anything for this demo. Okay. Oops. Okay. So this is a short one, but useful. So if we open our console log, okay, so yeah, if we open the console log, we can see what it returns. So we declare a function up here, and it's the function keyword. So when you're making a function is a keyword, you're telling this is the function, and then you can name it. In this context, it's just no return. That's an arbitrary name. You could name it no return. I don't want return. You can't have white spaces, but it's just an arbitrary name. You know, feel free to name functions, whatever. And then these parentheses, that's where you put your parameters, as I mentioned earlier, what you send to the function. And if you leave the parentheses blank, the function just knows that it has no parameters. But you still want to tell it that, or otherwise it doesn't understand. The function won't understand that nothing's there. But if you just put it blank, it will. And then these brackets are just to enclose the function, or the braces, sorry, those are to enclose the function. And then all we're doing there is when we call this function down here, it's going to log this function has no return of parameters. Because as you can see, there's no parameters and there's no return statement after the log is empty. So as I mentioned, when I say call the function, when you make a function, it itself doesn't run in JavaScript. When you write it, it sees it's a function and recognizes it's there, but it doesn't do anything until you tell it to. So down here, see how we have function no return, and then we say no return, and that's when you actually call the function. It's the same name as this function up here, and then you just send it no parameters because the function itself has no parameters. Then the semicolon to end the statement, and that's when you call it, and it'll execute what's in the body of the function, which in this context is just simply a console.log statement. Then, very similar example, this function has no parameters, but has a return statement. So it's going to return, and this is just arbitrary text, but this function has a return value, because as you can see, it's going to return. And then when we call this function down here, so what it does is when you have a return value, you want to return it to a variable. So there's the same function down here, no params, which is the same as up here. You just set it equal to, in this context, let test return to anything, because that variable stores the data, the return data from the function. And then when you call it, if you console.log the test return, which is the variable, it's going to say it has a return value, which is nice because then you recognize that it has a return value. So that's the key there. When you return, you want to set it equal to a variable to hold the data. And then the last one has parameters and a return. And yeah, there we go. So then as you can see, when you put it all together, this was my example earlier of using a sum, you send it the first parameter, the second parameter, and then it returns the sum of the parameters. So in this context, when the same variable as above, just reassigning it, the variable is equal to the function, and you send it the numbers 1 and 2, it's going to log the variable, which is the function. So it calls the function, returns 1 plus 2 is 3. And that, as you can see, the console log 3. And the nice thing is if I was to add test, let's say we wanted to add 6 plus 3 should return 9. As you can see there's 9. And that's really nice because then instead of having to do a function, writing out that functionality so many times, now you can just call it and use it endlessly. So once you've made a summation function, you never have to worry about doing that addition ever again. You can just call the function with your two numbers, any two numbers. As I said, these could literally be any two numbers. Do that one. Any numbers, and it'll just add 4. And that's the key to the function, is then you can just keep calling them repeatedly whenever you like, and it'll do that functionality for you. All right, so now we're going to move on to our first checkpoint, and that's going to be try writing the FizzBuzz program in your editor. So I believe there's one on the next page. There it is. So yeah, the checkpoint number 1 is a FizzBuzz. And that's going to be write a function that prints the numbers from 1 to 100, right? So just think of how you're going to display all the numbers from 1 to 100. And you don't, and just you don't want to just write console.log these numbers. But then the caveat is for multiples of 3, you want to print the word fizz instead of the number. For multiples of 5, you want to print the word buzz. And then for numbers that are multiples of both, you want to print FizzBuzz. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a key math operator when it comes to using multiples and remainders. So that's the hint for that, is definitely going to want to utilize that. So try that on your own now. Use your text editor and just, you don't have to connect it to HTML right now, but just open a text JavaScript and be able to run it there. We'll give some time for that. I'll give you a little time. Let me know if you have any questions, reach out in the chat. Okay, so moving on after functions are JavaScript arrays. So think of arrays as like a group of things and that are mathematically organized. So in this example here, it's just an array of a couple of different things. We've got the numbers, a negative, a decimal, which is a floating type, and then true. And that's just a Boolean state, so a 1. And they're defined by using square brackets, and then not the curly braces for functions. And each value is separated by a comma. So if you wanted whatever it is, 124, 124, comma, your next value. And then they can hold any type or quantity of data. You can have basically as many things in your array as the program computer can hold. There's not really a limit there. And then one important thing in your acronyms is they are 0 index. So the first element in the array is not at index 1, it's at index 0. So for example, if you wanted to access the index of this number 1 is 0, and the index of the 2 is number 1. And that's important when you access them through loops or when you're calling them from within a function, is when you're giving it the right number index, because if you don't, you might get confused, not figure out why it's giving you the wrong value. It's actually just this starts at 0. Then, for example, in this array that has 5 elements, the final array, the final value, true, is index 4. All right, then we're going to demo program 3. So that. Okay, so we're just going to start with the demo 3 JavaScript. So again, this is just a static HTML page. I'm worried about just there for the purpose of showing the JavaScript. So this here on the right, that's just an array, very similar to one you saw on the slide, just with some different values. We have a number, another number, a true statement, which is essentially a 1, then a word, which is a string, so test. And again, those strings are indicated by using quotation marks. And then we also just have a negative 4.5, so negative decimal. And then if you were to log the whole array, which we have here, being the output console.log, and we check the JavaScript log, it's going to print or output the entire array. Launch the right one. Yeah, sorry, there we go. So there's the array. And as you say, if you click down on it, you can see all the elements of it: 1, 4, true, test, and negative 5. And then it also turns the length. It's handy. And then, so then our next statement over here is we log the array.length. That's why it prints that. So that's over here, and then it prints the 5 because it'll tell you that there's 5 elements. And again, that's not to confuse with the index. The index goes up to 4, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, but the length will tell you how many elements are in the array, which would be 5. And then this is how we actually access the individual values in an array through indexing. Is we start console.log array of 3. So it's going to get the array at 3 being the third index, the index of value 3. And that, as you can see, is going to be the 1 because it's, oh, sorry. No, it's going to be the test. I'm sorry. Because the 1 is index 0, the 4 is index 1, This is index 2. So the test, the word, is going to be the third index. So when you log array of index 3 of the array, you're going to actually get the fourth element, which in this case is test. And then this shows when you log the 0, the array, index 0 of the array, you're going to get the first element, which is 1. And that's shown right below the test statement. And this is just a separator because we're going to use similar stuff for the demo 4. So don't worry about that. So this is just showing how you can make an array. It's just the same variable name. You use let and then any arbitrary array name, array, my array, your array, anyone's array. It doesn't have to have array in it either, it can be anything. But anyway, it's the square brackets for the elements, and then you can access each one to indexing. And then an important feature we'll get to later on is you can go through a loop and get each element of the array by using a counter variable, making the index the variable, and that will change, and you can end up with getting each element, and you can manipulate that however you need. All right, moving on. All right, so JavaScript objects. These are very useful. A very popular way to transfer data is with JSON. So the best way to describe that is, as up there, the JavaScript object notation. We'll get more to that later on. But a JavaScript object is basically, think of it as like an object that contains different things. So for example, it's like a car dealership. Could be an object that contains the different cars and all their information. That'll be important when we move on to the next checkpoint. But then, so JSON specifically is really a format for transferring data across websites. And the format of it basically is structured in a way that's very similar to how JavaScript reads objects. And then when it takes that data, you can perform a function on it, take that data from a website, for example, and convert it to information in JavaScript that can be parsed. Then you can manipulate that information. It's really useful, really powerful. We'll cover it more on, but that's just manipulating data from websites using JSON. Okay, so now getting more into actual JavaScript objects, which I mentioned before. So they use a key value pair. So think of these as like a dictionary, for example. You have the key being a word, and then the value being its definition. So, if you had the word, any word, like house, and then the next to it would be the definition of a house. Obviously, we're not using dictionaries with objects, but that's similar to how it works. And it's going to have a colon to separate. So the key is your name, and you use colon, and then you give it a value. A number, a word, a string, a true, a false, a decimal, whatever. But that's the notation of it and the syntax. And then, as I mentioned, the key can reference the string data. All right, then program number 4. I briefly touched on earlier. So this is the same page that you saw before for demo 3, but now we're going to show demo 4 JavaScript file. So this is just the basic syntax for creating a JavaScript object. It looks a little long, but don't be too intimidated. So to start off, it's just the let, that's the keyword for making a variable, then object. And then that's just the name of it. It can be any name. Let my object, let objects, let the cool object, whatever it is. And then when you make an object, you contain the values all within braces. Think of that much as like a function or a loop. You want to contain everything that's in it by the braces, both for readability and so the program can understand what's within the object and what's not. Then below that shows, that's a lot of examples of our key value pairs. So for here, school is our key, and then use colon to separate, and then you give it the value, Purdue. And then you can separate each element within the object by commas. So once you have school comma 2, you can comma, then your next one, the location being your key, then you give it the value for location, zoom. And then continuing down, you can use strings, numbers,
You can even do an array. So this case, this is just the name array. That's your key. So if you search for array, it'll give you this array, which is just an array of arbitrary values. And then you close the brace, and you do that, and you end with a semicolon, because you're ending with a statement. The object is like an initialization of values, and any command like that, you just end with a semicolon. So that's why a semicolon follows the braces. So then, as we console.log, I'll open the console again. So, and we have first it prints the object. So if you print just the object itself, it's going to give you a lot of information about it. It's going to give you, we're out of order, but it's going to give you the array, as you can see in there, is online, the participants, the school, and the location. A little out of order. I'm not sure why I did that. But anyway, if you print just the object itself, it's going to give you all the information about it. Yeah, it's going to give you all the information about it. And then these values can be accessed either through dot syntax or brackets, which indicate like the index. So moving down here, if you want to log, so before we log the object itself, if you do object and then using square brackets similar to array indices, you put in school, and school again being, that would be your key. So like if you want to search the object for the school, you can put in your key value there, and then it's going to print Purdue, because that's the value of the school. So it's like again, that's why I like the dictionary example. Think of it as searching for school, and then it's going to find what's next to school, Purdue. You can also use dot syntax, which I actually prefer, but either one's fine. If you just say object dot school instead of using the indices search, you can just say dot school, it'll print the school, which is the same Purdue. Then what you can do is you can actually change the object. That's the other nice thing, is you can change them. So if you said call the object and then use the dot, or you can use the brackets, either one where we use dot here, object.location equals online. So it finds the object, searches for location, finds location, and sets it equal to online. So that's basically changing its definition in the dictionary, for example. And then when you log it, object.location, instead of printing the original zoom, it now prints online, which is nice, because then you can change the values as you go throughout your program. And then you access them with either dot syntax or bracket syntax. And that's really nice about objects, is then you can store a bunch of information that's all related in one section. Yeah. Check, yeah. All right, so checkpoint number 2. And this, as I mentioned earlier, nice thing about objects, so you're going to create a dealership using arrays and objects. All right, so this is just moving on part 2, responsiveness. And that's more or less just having JavaScript interact with HTML to make it responsive and provide all the functionality that we're looking for. All right, so modifying HTML and CSS, as I already said, we can modify this from JavaScript using the document keyword that I mentioned way at the beginning of the lecture. We're not going to spend a ton of time, mostly because of the framework that we're going to be using starting next week will do a lot for us, but introducing the basics and how it works helps understanding of the process. So referring to HTML elements. A key way to do that is using the class and ID fields that we talked about from last week. So when you make a tag, however you do that, you can provide it with an ID and then write the ID or a class. The key being IDs is specific to one tag, and a class can contain multiple tags if they're similar and belong in a class. And then you can use these to reference the elements or the group of elements. The group of elements being a class, and an individual element in theory being the ID. And you can reference those in JavaScript by calling their ID or class name that you gave them in HTML. And then they can be modified, retrieved, used to perform operations. All right, so the methods to change the HTML, the 2 ways to do it with ID and class. The top one does it with by ID. So if you're searching for one, an element with an ID name, in this case only one, because it's by ID, so it'll return to one element.
So it's the document keyword and then dot syntax is very common in JavaScript. Document that get element by ID. Get element by ID is just a function. That's standard. You're going to write that out. That is not an arbitrary name. That's just a function you call. And then in the parentheses, instead of blank, you'll put what your ID you're searching for. So if you name your H1 tag header, ID equals header, you could search document that get element by ID and quotations header, and then it'll basically find that tag and the contents of it. Then you can manipulate it. Similar with class name, document that get elements plural, because a class is, if you're making like class description, you should have multiple elements. It's going to return all those elements with the certain class name. So if you name H1, H2, H3 class headers, you could search by headers and it'll get all of those elements. I guess, well, I moved on, but one important thing is you can change, what you can do with that is once you have that, you can change the HTML and just access it. And that's really cool. So moving on to event handlers, think of that as like when you're clicking a button or hovering over a button or leaving a button. There's a lot of event handlers that JavaScript can do. The most common is definitely clicking the button. We'll show more of what it can do later, but that's the key point. So if you add onClick to the HTML buttons, it will run some JavaScript when it is called. And that's where these functions are key, is you don't want to, put JavaScript in there. But if you put it in a function, you can run that function by putting the function name in the HTML tag. So if you make a button and then on click, that's a keyword. So when it's clicked on the click, and you put equals some function. So in the quotations or the quotations, but what some function will be a function you have in your JavaScript file. And then when the button is clicked, it's going to say on click, and then it's going to call that function. Let's say that function was print hi. So then you can put function some function console.log hi. Then when you click the button, it'll put hi into the console. We saw it before. So that's really useful. And then obviously, as you know, that the text, that's just what's going to show up on the button, and then you can close your tab. And that's really useful. So, and that's going to be important in your final project generally, is being able to handle different events, manipulate the HTML with buttons. Demo program 5, show that off. Okay, this is probably the coolest one we have. So it's not super complicated. Yeah. So what's going to happen is, you have this HTML page, and this actually can change. So if you look to the right in our JavaScript, we have a function called change page, we've seen before. And so this is just let p tag, that's an arbitrary name. And that's going to, when it says dot get element by ID, so what it's going to do is search for the element with the ID that's called please change. And if you look at this HTML file, there it is. So this p tag, paragraph tag named ID please change. So it's going to find this tag, and that tag corresponds to this text. As you can see, this page will not change, this page will not change. And then what it does is when it's run, it's going to, so then .inner HTML, that's basically key for accessing the HTML. So it's going to say p tag, which is the name of a variable, .inner HTML equals this page is changed. So it's going to change the HTML text to this page is not changed. And then that function is called, not in the JavaScript, but it's called in the HTML on this button. Button on click equals change page. Click me. See this button, click me here. So what happens is when we click it, it's going to call the change page function. As you can see, this text has changed, along with the blue, which I'll get to in a second. But when it was clicked, it's going to change. It does not change. We'll go back. But when you click it, it changes. And then same with the JavaScript down here. It's going to same concept. Let h tag document that get element document that get elements by class name heading. So now what it's going to do is find all the HTML elements with the class name heading. And as you can see here, we have this header heading, this header heading, and that's it. So there's two headers with the class heading. And when you search there, it's going to find all the elements with that class name heading.
And then it's going to go through. And so this for loop, basically that's what's doing is it's saying for each element, change the style color to blue. Because you say h tags at index I, so that's your variable at the index, change the style color to blue for each element that has the class name headings. And that's going to be called in your HTML again. You see, or sorry, no, that's contained within the function. That's my apology. So it's called the same way on when you click the button, what it does is calls the function. So it changes the HTML in the green as you saw, and then it moves on and gets the heading and loops it. So when you click the button, it does it all in one swing. And then changes to blue. So it starts by finding the please change ID, changes that to that HTML text, and then it goes through and changes each element with the ID name heading, and all it does is change the style to blue. And again, you could change the text too. So it doesn't really matter, but if h tags inner HTML equals heading. Oh, sorry, because that's by class ID. So never mind. Don't worry, ignore that. But regardless, the style color change is just an arbitrary change for the purpose of the demonstration. But the important key takeaway is that when you go through and get each element, you can take the data about it and change it, manipulate it, do whatever you want. And that's key to changing how your page looks over time. Because like typically when you click the button, you want maybe a window to appear or go to a new page. And that's an important feature that you can do with these on clicks. All right, so this just shows some other resources for JavaScript. We went over the basics. As I mentioned, JavaScript super powerful, has a lot of really great features. These are just some of the basics. Async functions are really nice. Get requests, those are helpful for getting JSON from a website. And so if you're interested more into that, some of the in-depth, feel free to look at that. When we attached the reference, I think it's a really great reference, W3 Schools. And you don't even really need to remember the link to search W3 Schools at JavaScript and you'll find it. So that's really helpful if you want to go on your own and explore more about the programming. It's super nice. All right, so moving on to checkpoint number 3. And that's going to be modify the FizzBuzz program to add to the web page. So what basically you want to think is you have your FizzBuzz program from checkpoint number 1. Now think about as it prints things, or as it prints the numbers, how can you get it to also add/modify the web page? And that's sort of what we just talked about, is responsiveness changing the web page. Doesn't have to be super complicated, but just think about ways in which you can style it per se and modify it so it does that. All right, so just gonna keep working. I'm just gonna put this up now. Thanks for coming to the session today. I might want you to if you give us any feedback you have any other questions, you can ask us on Slack during our meetings or the review hours, office hours. If you haven't already, please fill out the attendance form that's on the first page of the slide. That way we can mark that everyone's here.